Coming up, the Brexitists do love to talk about democracy and the will of the people, don't they? But the truth is, they don't believe in either of those things. Since Britain left the European Union, with the possible exception of Caroline Lucas, our one Green MP, none of the parties in the House of Commons has advocated the UK rejoining the EU. Even though that is what an ever-increasing majority of the people have now wanted consistently for a while now, according to opinion poll trackers like this one. The majority voting Leave in the advisory referendum eventually got their way, against the will of all the parliamentary British political parties at that time. So can we now hope that the majority of the electorate wanting to find a way back into Europe will eventually get their way against all the bigger parties this time? Stay tuned as we take a look at how Brexit may shape up in 2023. If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out by hitting the like button and especially by sharing a link to this video on your social media platforms. As the new year starts, we can already see the direction of travel for Brexit. 2023 may not give us a definitive answer as to how and when this particular Brexit will perish, but it's increasingly clear that perish it will. The referendum on leaving the European Union was a promise made in the Conservative manifesto in 2015, and the Conservatives won that election. It's often said that Tory Prime Minister David Cameron simply added this irresponsible promise for the sake of internal Tory party management, in the belief that the 2015 election would deliver another coalition with the Lib Dems, and that Cameron could tell the Brexitist wing of his party that it was the coalition partners that were blocking any referendum. But the truth is, the Tory civil war was prompted not internally, but by the threat from UKIP to the Tory party. Either way, history will judge that Cameron put the needs of his party ahead of the economic and social well-being of the United Kingdom, and that he did so in an arrogant, thoughtless fashion. He needn't have kept his promise quite so hastily, scheduling the advisory referendum so early in his parliamentary term. He could have set a higher threshold than 50% or even a supermajority of 2/3 on what was at heart almost a constitutional issue. He could have allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to vote on their future. He could have decreed that all 4 nations of the United Kingdom had to vote in favour of leaving, or that there should be 2 referenda, the first on Brexit in principle and the second on the final negotiated Brexit deal. And this latter option would appear to have been a particularly democratic solution that would have resolved the utter mess and divisiveness of Brexit implementation, where 2 in 3 Leave voters are now saying that this isn't the Brexit they voted for. The trouble is, it sure as hell is the Brexit that us Remainers voted against. So don't try to tell me that those of us that were on the Remain side of the debate were being undemocratic. With a narrow vote in favour of leaving, it seems more democratic that, as Cameron failed to install the safeguards that should have been in place about the nature of the majority, the form of Brexit should have been as soft as possible to reflect that 52-48% split. But what we got instead was not democracy, but a tyranny of the majority. Without an emphatic mandate for leaving, the aim should have been to negotiate a new relationship with the EU that meant that we would be outside it, but as close to it as possible. The polls tell us that the main objections Brexitists had to EU membership was the political structure and the freedom of movement of people. Now, of course, I don't agree with them on either of those points, but what I'm saying is that provided we were not subject to future EU law, and that we could decide our own immigration policy, I do believe that the overwhelming majority of Leave voters would have been perfectly happy for our economy to remain closely integrated with the EU's and to have stayed in things like the European Medicines Agency, the Erasmus scheme for university exchange students, the Horizon scheme for unified scientific research, arrangements for Europe-wide transmission of British TV shows, and the touring deal for performance artists, and so on. It's not widely realised that this is precisely what Theresa May negotiated as her Brexit deal. It's just that she had to pretend for her party's sake that her Brexit was harder than it actually was. She secured an amazingly good deal, And to this day, I can't believe the EU actually agreed to it. Despite the hundreds of comments that I'm left here on this channel from people insisting that EU rules can't be bent to make an exception of the UK, the fact is that the European Union were willing to do precisely that. Britain could have had most of the advantages of EU membership without actually being a member and without accepting the free movement of people between the EU and the UK. Our so-called temporary membership of the EU customs union with Theresa May's deal meant for sure that our goods would have had to meet EU standards and that we also couldn't have an independent trade policy, but that didn't even figure in most Leave voters' concerns. Respected economists, including Paul Tucker, a former deputy governor of the Bank of England, said that the EU single market could still work well and still offer significant benefits without the free movement of labour. And talking of Labour, the Labour Party, in hindsight, should have voted for May's deal. Not only would it have secured a soft Brexit, but it would have absolutely destroyed the Tory party forever, with Theresa May leading a coalition government supported by Labour votes for as long as she could stick it. But with the Eurosceptic Jeremy Corbyn at the helm, it was never going to happen. Now, much as I was a supporter of the Corbyn manifesto, it was, from a pro-EU perspective, the wrong guy leading the opposition at the wrong moment. A scenario that resulted in the leadership tragedies of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and now Rishi Sunak. But hey, we are where we are, so let's look to the future. The question now is what happens to our relationship with the European Union in 2023. It's been 2 years since the UK left the EU single market at the end of the transition period. For a while, the catastrophe of leaving was camouflaged by the pandemic lockdown, but the economic damage is now becoming clearer by the week, with report after report showing the long-term damage inflicted by this needlessly hard Brexit. Every other major economy bar Russia has bounced back to pre-pandemic levels and beyond, except the UK. Compared to a doppelganger UK economy that stayed within the European Union, the Centre for European Reform is now reporting a 5.5% hit to the British economy and a 13.7% hit to long-term investment caused entirely by the Brexit deal we ended up with. No wonder then that public opinion has so significantly shifted. Ignoring don't knows, polling now tells us that an average of 60% say that the decision to leave the European Union was, in hindsight, wrong, and only 40% say it was right. Ah, you might say, that's not the same as 60% wanting to rejoin. And you're right, it's not. But what's even more significant is that when asked, should we rejoin, polls are now reporting that 56%, again excluding those don't knows, are now in favour of rejoining. And it's been the case for quite a while now that a significant majority have consistently expressed a preference to rejoin. Yet, as I said earlier, none of the major political parties are yet responding to this in their policies. What about the Lib Dems, you may ask, who the Express and the Mail are always accusing of a hidden plot to undo Brexit? Well, the Lib Dems' current policy, according to their website, is campaigning for a better relationship with our European neighbours. And you thought Keir Starmer was woolly. So far, the most promising sign of light at the end of the tunnel was when the anonymous source close to Jeremy Hunt, the current Chancellor, spoke to the Sunday Times recently about a Swiss-style deal. This source seemed to be so close to the Chancellor that he even sounded like Jeremy Hunt, who had 2 days earlier happened to have said in public that he was confident the vast majority of the trade barriers between the UK and the EU would be removed. Of course, the European research group, the mad ERG Brexitists on the far right of the Tory party, are never known for their calmness and rationality. They very quickly promised a swift and powerful kick in the balls if Sunak didn't immediately disown such tempered and reasonable dialogue in relation to any watering down of the current hard Brexit arrangements. A Swiss-style deal, translated into Brexitist, means freedom of movement between us and the EU, and hence too many bloody foreigners speaking in foreign while working in our fields, our NHS, or in our hospitality and care sectors. But, something something Albanian organised gangs, something something 5-star hotels, something. But back to Keir Starmer and his make Brexit work mantra. Now I know many of you watching will be saying, give the guy a break. And of course I agree that a Starmer government would be way better than a Tory one in every respect. But I don't have my Labour Party scarf knotted so tightly around my neck that I'm incapable of making constructive criticism. The fact is that it's not just me. Starmer continues to frustrate many pro-EU Labour voters by refusing to acknowledge that 1 in 3 Leave voters have now changed their minds and that a majority of the electorate now want to undo the current Brexit arrangements. A situation that makes his make Brexit work mantra sound absolutely pathetic and even cowardly. And I don't buy into the idea that he has to say it to avoid a Tory political trap or to safeguard the vote in the Red Wall. He didn't have to say it in the first place. He didn't have to say in a recent interview that rejoining the EU single market would not boost growth, when he must know that that is dishonest. He repeatedly says that there is no case for going back into the single market or the customs union, which is just not true. And his shadow International Trade Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds, doubles down on this. Fasten your seatbelt and prepare to be dismayed by his recent ejaculation. We will make Brexit work. We don't believe it is in the national interest to reopen this debate with all the division or the issues that would subsequently cause. We have set out our red lines, and there are 3 of them. No return to the single market, no return to the customs union, and no return to freedom of movement. I'm at the point now where I just wish the Labour Party would shut the hell up about Brexit altogether. Because every time they come out with these so-called red lines, Starmer is digging a hole for himself for when he's in a position to actually do something about the realities of Brexit harm. He thinks it would be daft to admit he'd be looking to move closer to the EU, as he believes there is a segment of the electorate who would go back to the Tories if they thought Labour was trying to reverse Brexit. And I don't have the same data as him from those Labour focus groups in marginal constituencies, so that may indeed be the case. But I do wish he'd stop these pretend shows of strength on Brexit, committing to holding the line against all the facts that Brexit is strangling this country. The economic, diplomatic, defence and social pressures in 2023 will inevitably move the country to a closer relationship with the European Union. And Starmer would be well advised to not say stupid things now that will mean it's more difficult for him to respond to reality when his chance comes. Which probably won't be in 2023 unless the Tory leadership suffers yet another massive meltdown. But even Sunak and Hunt are showing signs of moving a little bit closer towards a grown-up dialogue with the EU. The kite-flying talk of the Swiss model resulted in a strong rebuff from the right wing of the party. But Hunt, as we know, is a pro-EU voice, and Sunak's pragmatic approach to the Northern Ireland situation suggests compromise there, and a possible end to the confrontational approach of the Johnson and Frosty the No-Man years. 2023 will see the Tory government heading in the direction of favouring alignment with the EU rather than divergence. And in 2024, or early 2025, we will, in all likelihood, have a Labour government that will be almost without exception a government formed by ministers wanting alignment with the EU, not divergence. They'll probably be pushing for a policy not a million miles away from Theresa May's Brexit deal as a first step on the eventual road back into Europe, especially if the polls and the marginals continue to support that policy. The only problem is, getting to the point where we have a UK government that wants to move back towards EU membership is literally only half the battle. It takes 2 to tango. And our dance partner had their toes trod on far too many times during the UK's capricious, demanding and exceptionalist membership. There is no way that terms as favourable to the UK outside the EU, like Theresa May's deal, let alone inside the EU as we had before, will ever be available again. But we need a government that at least acknowledges the disaster of Brexit so that a coherent policy can be followed to minimise Brexit damage to our economy, our culture and our standard of living. Thanks to growing pressure from the electorate, 2023 may see a coerced government take the very first reluctant steps in that direction.